Thank you very much. I'm rather disappointed that we can't have a debate with Mr. Restagno over his presentation, because, of course, there's much to disagree with in that. I noticed he never mentioned unemployment once, when it's at abnormally high levels in the European Eurozone. Anyway, I'm not going to do that. I'm here to talk about just money. And I want to begin with this image, which is a vampire squid. A great vampire squid wrapped around the face of humanity, relentlessly jamming its blood funnel into anything that smells like money, which you all know is Goldman Sachs. And last week, Goldman Sachs was involved in an enormous controversy in Denmark when the Social Democratic government gave Goldman Sachs a 19% stake in a publicly owned energy company known as Dong. And with that 19% stake, Goldman Sachs was able to leverage its power over a whole state-owned corporation, so that they can now veto the appointments of chief executives, they can veto the business plan, and they can veto the sale of shares. So this is the way in which you gain economic power. You have a minority stake in a company, and that gives you enormous power over decision-making, even though 80%, but it's now declined to 60% of that company is owned by the state. So on 28th of January, Bloomberg announced that the Goldman had won Denmark, the Prime Minister's promise, that Dong would not fall apart. And quite right too, the deal was done, the deal was struck on the 28th. And on the 29th, the people of Denmark rose up in horror at what had happened to their publicly funded, taxpayer-backed corporation, energy company. But it was too late. It was a day too late. The deal had been done. So they began and they stood up, but they stood up rather hopelessly against the despotic power of the finance sector over their democratic state, their democratic institutions, their taxes. So what I want to talk about today is that actually for us to challenge the power of the finance sector, which is unbridled in its power, unregulated, uncontrolled across the world, we sit and wait for markets and for individual players in the bond markets who are all invisible to determine our fate, to determine whether or not unemployment in Europe is 12% or 3% or 15% or 18%. Our governments, our institutions, our publicly backed institutions like the ECB don't take responsibility for that. The responsibility for that seems to rest with these invisible, unaccountable financial markets. But in order to challenge finance, and I've only got 20 minutes to do this, we have to overcome our naive intuitions about money, and we'll have to forego the pleasures of irresponsibly ignoring the nature of money. To defend our democracies, we need to challenge the complacency and the indifference of Orthodox economics that stands aloof from the crisis, blaming human nature. I was at this university when I heard a very prominent economist say that the financial crash was down to greed, etc., human nature. If you can imagine engineers, physicists, chemists, and other intellectuals blaming an aeroplane crash on human nature, you can imagine how unprofessional is the economics profession when the architecture, the financial framework which they have constructed collapses, they blame it on human nature. If an aeronautical engineer did that when a plane crashed, we would be outraged. We're not. Economists regard the study of money and finance as a matter of third-order importance. I am quoting here a very important economist who holds an international position and whose identity I will protect. He said that money, and he advised a PhD student not to do a PhD in money and finance because money and finance, he said, is a matter of third-order importance. That's why, Mr. Restagno, nobody expected the crash. That's why nobody was able to predict the crash. I'm proud to say that I did, but there you go. So to be able to defend our democracies, we have to challenge finance. We will have to abandon our naive faith in economic orthodoxy, in Hayek, in Friedman, and in people like Mr. Eugene Farmer, who in 2013 was granted the Nobel Prize in Economics. This is what he said about the crisis when he was asked about the cause of the crisis. I do need some water, actually. I'm getting very carried away here. That's where economics have always broken down. We don't know what causes recession, says the Nobel Prize winner in economics. Now, I'm not a macroeconomist. I don't feel bad about that. He's a microeconomist. The world is a flood with microeconomists. We've never known. Debates go on to this day about what caused the Great Depression. Economics is not very good explaining swings in economic activity. God help us. If aeronautical engineers said that to us about what was happening in aeroplanes, what would we say? What would we? We're in this damn aeroplane. We're in this economy. We're living in this economy. And you're telling us that we are not very good at explaining it, the fact that I am unemployed, that millions of young people in Europe are unemployed, that Spain has the highest unemployment rate, higher than it was during the Great Depression. And you cannot explain that? Excuse me. The exogenous money fallacy. So most economists believe that patient money lends to impatient money, that patient's money spending power goes down, that impatient spending power goes up, that there's no change in aggregate demand, and that banks are merely intermediaries between borrowers and savers. And this is said repeatedly at very, very high levels, and by Keynesian and neo-Keynesian as well as orthodox economists. Paul Krugman is one of those who talks about banks merely as intermediaries. So private commercial bankers are not, nor ever have been, not since before 1694 when the Bank of England was formed, they have never been intermediaries. They are creators of credit. They are creators of the inflationary conditions that the ECB is so obsessed by, because they are the ones who create too much money, chasing too few goods and services. The central banks begin to create money in and to expand the balance sheets in times of crises. But 95% of the money that circulates in our economy is created by private banks out of thin air. And they've done that since before 1694. Now, I must say, I'm a great believer that this is a good thing, that with the creation of our monetary systems, we're able to finance what we need to do, that there need never be a shortage of finance in a well-developed monetary system. I've worked in Africa, where there are not monetary systems, by which I mean there are not laws of contract, there are not criminal justice systems, there are not a sound tax accounting system, not sound taxation systems. In those systems, you cannot ever be sure of having enough money. But in a world like our own, with strong monetary institutions and backed up by the law of contract, by criminal justice system, we need never, ever be short of money to create employment, for example, for Spain's millions of young unemployed people. So savings are not needed for investment. They never have been. They are not needed to kick-start economic activity, to create jobs. I heard this sad presentation by Dr. Saidi this morning, in which he said we need billions of dollars in a Middle Eastern development bank to create infrastructure, to create employment. I bet you when he goes anywhere to ask for that, they'll say, oh, but there isn't enough money for that. There is no money to invest in an EBRD, a Middle Eastern bank for reconstruction. There's no money. Well, we'll have to go and find somebody's savings in order to create employment in the Middle East. We never needed savings for investment. Bankers, please God, do not use their reserves parked in central banks to lend on. Reserves are the consequence of the creation of credit and of money. And there is no such thing, please, as a fractional reserve system of banking. There hasn't been since 1694. Commercial bankers do not lend the deposits of their customers on to borrowers. They don't need the deposits of their customers in order to lend. They never have. They need the deposits of their customers if they are going to go and borrow and speculate and gamble. They use their deposits as collateral. That's a different thing altogether. Bank credit money is produced out of nothing more than the promise of repayment. A promise backed up by collateral. If you're going to borrow for a mortgage, I want to have my hands on your property, and a contract to repay over time your mortgage for 30 years, and at a certain rate of interest. Eugene Farmer says, people who get credit have to get it from somewhere, he says, the Nobel Prize winner in 2013 in economics. Does a credit bubble mean that people save too much during that period? I don't know what a credit bubble means. I don't even know what a bubble means. The Nobel Prize winner in 2013 in economics. These words have become popular. I don't think they have any meaning. So he believes that that people saved too much before the crisis. That's why we had a credit bubble. It's extraordinary. But what's convenient about thinking like that is that you never have to regulate the banks. You don't have to regulate Mr. Goldman Sachs, because he's not the one creating the bubble and the credit. No, it's these guys over there who are saving too much. Bad guys saving too much that have created the bubble, not Mr. Goldman Sachs. So Mr. Goldman Sachs escapes free of the regulator's view. So credit creates purchasing power, which is why I think it's a great thing. It's a great civilizational advance when we moved from, barbaric barter towards the creation of credit, based on, by the way, the words credo, I believe that you will repay me. It's based on trust. I believe that you and I can make an exchange that will be fair and decent and honest, because you and I are fair, decent, and honest. And if we're not, we have institutions that try and keep us decent, fair, and honest. And that credit creates economic activity. It means that in a barren landscape where there is no money, no savings, we can, between us, create the credit that would create employment, that would generate economic activity, and with it income, profits, wages, salaries, and above all, tax revenues with which to repay the initial credit. So bank money issued as credit does not exist as a result of economic activity. The wonderful thing about it is that it creates economic activity. That's its great thing. So when I go to Africa, and there is no money to deal with HIV/AIDS, there is no money to save the lives of mothers dying in childbirth, you think all they need are monetary institutions which would enable the Africans to do what they can already do. And that is that enabling role that credit plays that is so wonderful. So bank money creates economic activity. But for financial stability and economic stability, credit must be used for productive, not speculative activity. Speculative activity is gambling. And you can win when you gamble. You can win fast. If you take out money in the lottery, you can make huge bucks overnight, effortlessly. It's a great thing. But you can also lose. And when you lose, you can lose very, very badly. But the whole point about effortless gaining of money is that it's amoral, for a start. It's amoral. You made money with doing nothing, more or less by ripping other people off. So therefore, if credit is directed towards productive activity, where you create real economic investment, sound investment in real projects that are needed, like, for example, green energy in Denmark, and that creates employment. Employment generates income, profits, tax revenues to pay for the investment. That's a sound, stable financial system. So it must be managed, of course. Of course it must be managed. I notice when the ECB talks about inflation, it talks obsessively about inflation. It never talks about deflation. There were no questions I heard today about the deflationary threat facing Europe. And I believe that the ECB, if I may say so in this space, is extraordinarily complacent about the threat of deflation. We can do more to control inflation than we can to control deflation. So the creation of credit has to be managed. You can't let the Goldman Sachses of this world loose on the world. They have to be managed. They have to be regulated. They have to be told that your investment, your credit must go into productive activity. If it goes into speculative activity, then it cannot ever be guaranteed by the taxpayer. But furthermore, you shouldn't be doing this anyway. And if you want to do it, go off and do it on your own. So you have to ensure that there's not too much credit chasing too few goods and services. I notice how often the unions and ordinary farmers and people in the markets and the energy sector are always blamed for inflation. Inflation starts always with banks creating too much credit, chasing too few goods and services. And when you understand that, you know how to control inflation. You regulate the bank's creation of credit. That's what we did between 1945 and 1971, when inflation wasn't a problem in the way it became after the 1970s, when we liberalized the banking system. And we said, go create credit all you like. The market will discipline you. The market will discipline the borrowers. Don't worry about it. And then we got inflation. And what do? We blame the unions. The banks never got any credit for creating inflation. So, for financial stability, it's really important also that banks shouldn't contract the creation of credit, because by doing so, they contract the level of economic activity, they contract profits, they contract income, they contract tax revenues. And you know, this is the recipe of the Eurozone, and I'm afraid of this country. Contracting economic activity is highly fashionable. Austerity is the thing to do. What that does is to contract the level of income for the repayment of a huge amount, a vast amount of debt that these sovereigns and private sectors were allowed to borrow like crazy before the crisis. So we have now a vast overhang of sovereign and private, corporate, household and individual debt, and we're now deflating the economy, contracting the ability of the economy to generate the income to repay that debt. Crazy economics. So for financial and economic activity, and for reasons to do with morality, interest rates, in my view, should always be low. I noticed the ECB talked about policy pass-through. The fact of the matter is that after the 1960s and 70s, the central banks gave up their control over the whole spectrum of interest rates. They were left to the market. The only rate they control is the base rate. The base rate is irrelevant in the real economy. How many people starting a new business are borrowing at the base rate? How many people starting a risky enterprise in, for example, green energy, are borrowing at the base rate? None that I know of. So the central banks have left that to the market. And the market, of course, is extracting every pint of blood it can out of all assets like, for example, Denmark's green energy. So interest rates, and this is, of course, Keynes's general theory of employment, interest, and money, not the general theory of tax and spend. So finance must be managed by democratic institutions, which are underpinned by society's values of trust, honesty, justice, and fairness. We need institutions that uphold those, that keep us honest. Bitcoin is a currency that's based on dishonesty, that's based on not having any form of regulation, that's based on being outside all monetary institutions. And Bitcoin is therefore a great big gamble, but in my view it's also a huge Ponzi. It's just no different from Madoff's plan. But let's not go down that road. So we need institutions that uphold trust, honesty, justice, and fairness. Is that a red light I see there? That is a red light. I do beg your pardon. So I think I've said quite enough. All I want to say is that capital mobility at the same time must be managed, as Jagdish Bhagwati has most powerfully argued, unless we want this great big vampire squid to take over the world. And that's my book. Thank you very much, and I do apologize.
I'd like to thank Ms. Pettifor very much for a thoroughly engaging talk there. And I'll open it up to you guys straight away. So any questions, please. Here at the front row. Great.
Thank you very much for a very engaging talk.
I like that, very engaging. It's the politest thing I've heard for a long time.
And very exciting. It sounded like at the end you're kind of hoping that we all live in some kind of Plato's Republic.
So some kind of?
Plato's Republic.
Plato's Republic.
Exactly, where all the leaders are very honest, trustworthy individuals. People respect each other through some kind of very optimistic view of human nature. But of course, to go back to your aeroplane example, when we talk of aeroplanes flying, if you ask me why does that aeroplane fly, and I reply, oh, human nature. That's almost as bad an answer, I think, than to ask why it crashes, oh, human nature. What makes an aeroplane fly is not human nature alone, but rigorous scientific processes and all other kinds of industry that go into it.
I agree completely.
Now, how do we bring this kind of rigor to our institutions? Because simply standing up and saying we need honesty isn't good enough.
No, of course it isn't, and I never said that. I said we needed regulatory institutions that keep us honest. So the regulatory institutions are the law. If I lie to you or I break my contract, I go to jail, okay? I have a justice system where I'm judged for doing wrong. I have the monetary system, I have a central bank, I have a private banking system. In poor countries, the IMF and the World Bank advises poor countries not to build those public institutions. It says you don't need those things. Leave it to the global capital markets to raise funds for you. So they don't have those institutions, so they can't create money. So of course I agree with you entirely. No, I have no illusions about human nature, my own and others. I know that I need to work within a framework where, for example, when I see a red light on the street, I stop at the red light because on my bicycle I'm always very tempted to go through it. So I need some kind of regulation, and but the free market ideologues argue that I don't, that actually I'm quite sensible enough to be able to, look after my own interests, and I'm unlikely to go through a red light. I prove them wrong every day on my bicycle.
Thank you.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for your talk. And I completely agree with you that you need to invest money in productive, not speculative activities.
Yeah.
The only difficulty I see is that with the inherent uncertainty in our world, sometimes they are very hard to tell apart. I do not believe that everyone who lent money on questionable projects was actually believing that they were doing long-term speculations. I'm sure there was a large part of that. But there was also people who generally believed that what they were doing were sound investments that got proven wrong by the turn of events. So how would you deal with this problem?
Sure. I mean, that is absolutely right. And the whole point, for me, the banker's art is that she should be able to make those judgments. And those judgments should be made on the basis of sound economic theory. That's why the economics profession is so important, because the banker's got to be thinking about whether or not that's a productive or a speculative activity. So look at what's happening right now. Banks are lending crazy money so that people can inflate the value of existing assets in the centre of London, property. I know because I live there, and it's amazing what's happening. I haven't added an extra bathroom to my flat, but it's gone up in value. While the Russian oligarchs around in my part of the world push up the value of my property. Now, the Bank of England knows exactly what is going on, okay? But the free marketeers tell us, no, the market will correct itself. Don't worry about this, it's going to be okay. The Bank of England knows that help to buy votes is what I call it, help to buy is inflating the value of existing assets. That's speculation. It's not creating new assets. It's not engaged in productive activity. But the Bank of England is helpless because it's tied by an economic ideology, which is that we need to leave this to happen and the market will free itself. When it pops, when it explodes, when it implodes, if people are homeless, tough. That's the ideology within which the careful judgments you make about whether something is productive or speculative has to be made. And, we've got to get that right. But that's why bankers, that's why I want bankers to be boring old bankers, so that they sit and look carefully and study, instead of just picking up a phone and saying, do you want 10,000 quid? Do you want 10 million bucks? You can have it tomorrow. Don't ask any questions about how you're going to spend it. Just give me 15% on that 10 million bucks. That's the kind of world we live in, where there's no questions asked and easy money at high rates of interest is spewed around. Yeah.
So thank you very much for enthusiastic speech. Regarding the regulations, how do you assess the impact of the new regulation law, for example, Basel III, on the banking system?
Because it's based, in my view, on a flawed understanding of the nature of credit, I think it's deeply flawed. You know, having these limits on capital, banks don't need capital in order to lend. They need capital in order to borrow, but they shouldn't be borrowing anyway. We should have a reinstate Glass-Steagall, and the money and the investment side of the bank should be separated from the retail side. And if they want to borrow money, they should be able to borrow that money on their own capital with their own equity. But Basel doesn't alter this, doesn't do anything about the structural situation of the banks, and instead it imposed these extremely odd capital limits, because banks don't need capital in order to lend. It's crazy. What they need is collateral, they need a contract, they need a rate of interest, they need some certainty that the borrower is going to be able to repay. If you're lending money in a world of austerity, well, why on earth would you lend money in a country engaged in austerity policies? Because what is happening, the government, the central banks, is mandating the contraction of income. And so in that, if I were a bank now, I wouldn't lend a penny, because everybody's income's contracting. So therefore, you know, so Basel is not doing anything about that. Instead, it has these crazy capital buffers, which I really personally, frankly, don't understand, and I don't see how they apply. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your really engaging speech. I'm Christopher Skakas from the University of Glasgow, and let me tell you my reading of the free market. Just that the free marketeers recognized that there was a social and economic growth and welfare generated out of unregulated markets. And they want to replicate this kind of model to other markets as well. But don't you think that regulation will be retarded? If we impose regulation and laws and all this framework of institutional constraints will retard growth and innovation in the markets overall? Thank you.
No, not at all. And the reason I feel confident about that is that's exactly what we did between 1945 and the late 60s, early 70s. And we had the highest rates of growth in the world. With liberalization, post-1970s, growth rates declined, unemployment rose, productivity fell. So no, we have the evidence that regulation doesn't kill innovation and it doesn't kill economic activity. On the contrary, we had higher rates of employment and activity in that period than we have now. And we didn't have the kind of financial crises that we've had, which have been systemic since the 1970s. 45 to 71, anyone who reads Eich & Green will know that it was a period of extreme calmness, to use the ECB's language. You know, it was a deeply boring period. There were virtually no financial crises in the world. Since 71 and liberalization, we've had constant crises. And they began on the periphery, and this is where I began my work, in the poorest countries, which began to build up the first sovereign debts. And then they gradually moved towards the core until they exploded with Lehman's in 2008. But it was inevitable. It was inevitable. It was just kept at the periphery almost by accident, basically. But it began closer and closer to move into the core. So what you get from liberalization is volatility, instability, and nobody who wants to invest and make profits and employment and be productive and innovate can actually do that effectively within a volatile and unstable economy, which is what we've had since the early 70s.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.